We are talking today about the ethics of gender equality in science and research. I will start from the definition of ethics of research. What is ethics of research and why ethics of research is interested by the gender equality in science? Ethics of research involves the application of fundamental ethical principles to research activities that include how to design, how to implement a research project, how to evaluate the data, how to analyze them, but it also refers to the way the researchers have to behave during their work, their activity, the kind of interaction they have with their colleagues during their research activity as scientists, not only toward the other colleagues, but also toward the society as a whole. Among the other values that are supported by ethics of research, there are some values that are really important for the work of a scientist and researchers. Among them, the responsibility in mentoring, which means how to evaluate, how to help, how to train a new scientist. The respect for the colleagues, that involves, of course, the respect of your companions in the journey of science. The social responsibility of scientists, so how the scientists should be involved in building a better society. And last but not least, the non-discrimination, so the avoiding of discrimination not only among scientists but also the discrimination of the topics of research, so how to be as inclusive as possible in the journey of science. What are the legal roots of gender equality in the light of ethics of research? There is one basic chart that we always have to remember, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was signed by the United Nations in 1948. There are two important articles, the Article 1 and the Article 2, so the beginning of the Human Declaration of Human Rights. The first one states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, so woman, man, whoever. And the Article 2 is even more specific. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. So actually, the Declaration of Human Rights is the root, the legal and ethical root of gender equality. What is the gender dimension of ethics? So ethics of research focus on three dimensions of gender equality in research: sexism, implicit bias, and sexual harassment and assault, and we will dive into each of them. What do we mean by sexism? Sexism is defined as the prejudice or discrimination based on sex, especially in the form of discrimination against women, but not only, as we will see. It also means that in some way sanction any unfair treatment of people based on their sex or gender. Although the origin of the term goes back to the 70s and 80s, to the roots of modern feminism, it is now widely used in ethics of research, in ethics, and even in common language. Sexism is based on the idea that women are inferior to men and functions to oppress women in society. So sexism is not only a matter of behaviors and languages, but also of the purpose of certain behaviors, which is to always bring back the women to their status of inferiority. Sexism may arise because of socialized concept of privilege and entitlement. Some groups can think that they are entitled to discriminate women, and this is the origin of sexism. So it's a voluntary behavior. And according to Eurofund 2018, a survey that was conducted in 5 countries, including France, Denmark, and the UK, a significant number of men also suffer from gender discrimination, especially in fields like health research, environments where women are, let's say, dominant in terms of numbers. But we still think, as experts in ethics, that there is a difference between these two kinds of sexism, because the sexism against women is actually based on a structural, historical condition, while the sexism against men can also have cultural roots, but is more embedded and shrinked in the environment. So in some way it is often easier to fight sexism against men than sexism against women. But sexism can also be implicit. Actually, it's more common to have implicit bias toward women. According to the US National Judicial Education Program, which is one of the most important documents on education in the United States, the most prominent form of gender bias are the stereotype thinking about the nature and roles of women and men. The fact that we devalue what is perceived as a woman's work, that is less important than the man's work. The lack of knowledge of the social and economic realities of women's and men's lives. So how the social and economical framework shapes the relationship between gender. Implicit or unconscious bias refers to, as the term says, unconscious and automatic features and prejudice. So it's something we don't do voluntarily, but reflects our inner thoughts, even thoughts that we don't like, but that appears in our behavior. Implicit sexism was first analyzed through very well-known studies in the 70s, conducted between the 70s and the 80s. It was a study conducted among the New York Orchestra. The researchers put the candidates to enter into the orchestra behind a wall, a separation between the candidate and the judges, and demonstrated with numbers that when the judges did not know the sex of the musician, the opportunities for women to be recruited were much higher than for men. There is a very well-known episode that everybody knows about sexism in science, especially implicit bias toward women. It's something that happened in 2005. Harvard President Lawrence Summers, during the inauguration of the academic year, stated that the number of scholars in economics and maths was lower in terms of women. Women were underrepresented in these areas because they were, let's say, in some way biologically less prone to select this kind of topics. This sentence that actually cost to Summers his position as the dean of Harvard was a blatant example of implicit bias. Certainly Summers didn't express the explicit bias toward women, but still in his mind, his idea was that women were less adapted to study math and economics. It's not the only case. Even a very well-known episode that was highly covered even by newspapers is what happened to Nobel Prize Tim Hunt, a scientist that was actually invited to express his opinion on women in science during a conference of the World Science Journalism Association. What Tim Hunt did as a joke was he stated that beautiful women should avoid being part of research groups or labs because they would distract the attention of the scientist. It was a joke, but it was a joke full of implicit bias. And actually what happened after this sentence is that there was, of course, a Twitter storm among the journalists that were attending the conference, and Tim Hunt tried in many ways to solve the issue, explaining why that this was just a joke, why he said what he said. But actually what was more interesting than Tim Hunt's unfortunate sentence was the reaction of the scientific environment, because a lot of scientists actually tried to support Tim Hunt, putting on the plate, balancing his unfortunate sentence with his scientific merits. Nobody was discussing his scientific merits. The topic was, is it acceptable as a scientist to have such a high level of implicit bias and keep the positions you have in science? According to the women scientists that were in the room when he said what he said, this was impossible. You cannot be the dean, you cannot be the chief of a lab if you think as Tim Hunt what Tim Hunt expressed. But according to a large majority of the scientific community, this was perfectly acceptable, and a lot of voices actually supported him as, let's say, a mistake that can happen. One of the reasons why we have implicit bias in science is also because we often portray women scientists as women. The first thing that we do when we cover science that is performed by a woman, is to portray the scientist as a woman, highlighting how good she was in overcoming the barriers that women scientists have to overcome. This is a matter of discussion even among the media, because it seems to increase the level of implicit bias. This is an article that was published on Scientific American. It's interesting because it was describing the way the media portray women scientists. In particular, the article describes what happened when the neuroscientist Susan Greenfield became the first woman to receive a very prestigious position in 1994, and the fact that all the newspapers underlined the fact that she was a great scientist but also a beautiful woman. This small details keeps on fostering the implicit biases. What happened is that in 2013, a young science journalist, Anne Finkbeiner, was assigned to cover the story of a woman scientist, and she wrote for Scientific American this piece stating that her commitment was to cover the science and not the person. So actually she was trying to find a way not to underline the status of woman of the scientist, but more what the scientist had done and what the scientist had developed. She wrote that unless the editors badly want me to do, then I will, but I won't like it. So I won't like to cover the woman scientist as a woman. So what happened is that after this piece, another science journalist, Christina Schwanden, developed the so-called Finkbeiner test. It's let's say a set of rules on how we should portray women scientists. According to Ashwander, there are a few rules that we should follow when we cover a woman scientist. We should never say that she's a woman. So you understand it by the name, probably by the picture, but there is no reason to underline the fact that she's a woman. We do not underline that a scientist is a man. We don't have to mention in the article her husband's job, nor her children's arrangements, nor that she nurtures her underlines, or how she was taken aback by the competitiveness in her field, or how she managed to overcome the barriers. Everything that is, let's say, something that fosters and supports the implicit bias toward women scientists. Another strategy, of course, that could limit the implicit biases also within the scientific community is to be more inclusive in the way we involve scientists in the public debate. This is a tweet from a few years ago. In 2017, a very well-known science journalist, Ed Young, stated that 1 year before, he started tracking the gender balance in the sources of his stories, and he realized that only 25% of the stories he used to cover involved a women scientist, and he actively tried to increase this percentage up to 50%. And this is something that we can do, of course, science journalists can do, but also institutions should do. This is the reason why this movement started from science journalism, but it's really, really important for the academic world, for the press offices of the universities, for the institution, how to show, how to push forward the position of women scientists. There are classical approaches to increase women in science, like engaging families and communities in promoting STEM careers for girls, engaging girls and women in exploring social-scientific issues, in promoting social support for women and girls who want to enter into science, and developing also a leadership of women in STEM. But this is not enough, and we know now that this kind of education, inclusive education towards science is certainly the basic approach to include women in science, to increase the number of young girls who wants to be scientists. But it's not enough, because one of the issues is not only to engage the women in science, and the number of women engaged in science is now increasing in our societies, but to help them reaching the higher position in the scientific career. So it's important, in my view, to have some figures to understand how many women we have in science and what are the statistical data we have. So one of the important sources for us to understand this is the Eurostat survey. The last one was conducted in 2018, and just pictured the situation in science. Eurostat stated that there were 2.6 times as many male compared with female graduated from engineering, manufacturing, and co-construction related fields, and 3.9 times as many male graduates for information and communication technologies. So one of the main areas where we have issues is not necessarily life science or basic science, but it's really the science that brings to development of technologies in the society. This is particularly important now, because one of the things that we understand from ethics of research is that any technical development that comes from science actually has a huge impact on the society. One of the fields of ethics of research that is under development in recent years is what we call the technology impact assessment of new developments in science. It means that we try to understand each innovation, how it will impact on the life of our society. Just think about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence developed only by men will certainly bring to an increase in gender gap, because the artificial intelligence just mimic the relationship between human beings. So the way we build a new technology will shape also the use of this technology in the society. That's why it is really, really important to increase the number of women in the areas of the society of science that bring to technological development. Another interesting data that we have from Eurostat is that at the level of the member states of the European Union, there are as many women as men in university level education. So we don't have anymore a problem of access of women to the higher level of education. In 2020, there were 31.4 million women that were working in services activities in science, compared to 2.4 million in manufacturing activities in the European Union. That means that women are employed in science and technology and work predominantly in service activities. That means that they do not develop the science. They are supporting those who develop the science. There are two exceptions, Malta and Turkey, and there are two reasons for this. Malta and Turkey have respectively 48% and 43.9% of women involved in developing technologies. And the reason is that the access of the women to science and engineering in these countries is relatively young. So, because it's young for everybody, the percentage of women is almost 50-50, while in countries that have an older tradition in these fields, the men are still predominant. What about the gender gap in research? An analysis by sex shows that men accounted for approximately 2/3, so 67% of the EU workforce in research in 2019. Women accounted for just over half of the total number of researchers only in one country, Latvia, where there were a little bit more than half, so 50.6%. The share of women in the total number of researchers was close to parity in Lithuania, Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria, and all were above 45%. And the gender gap was the largest in France, Czechia, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The reason is again that the countries that have an older development of science, so a well-established old scientific environment, are incredibly, but not so much, refractory to include women in the scientific community. And these are the data, country by country, for those who want to check where their country is. But as you can see, the blue line are male researchers, the orange line are women researchers. There are very few of them, only the first two ones that are almost 50-50. And if you consider that in most of the European countries, the women represent even more than 50% of the population, we are on average around 55, you easily understand that the women are underrepresented. What about the doctoral students? A similar but more specific measures of country potential research capability is provided, of course, by the number of PhD students. In 2019, there were an estimated 651,000 doctoral students in the European Union, and women accounted for slightly less than half, 48%. The gender split of doctoral students across the EU member states was typically quite balanced. Women accounted for more than half of all the doctoral students in 13 out of 27 member states in 2019, with a peak in Cyprus, Lithuania, and Estonia. So, what is the issue here? We could say, that's fine, in the future, the gender gap will be closed by those numbers. We are already 50-50. This is not true, because when we look at the highest position in science, what we see is that the number of dropped out along the career of a scientist is much larger in women than in men. And when we reach the upper position, especially in the academic world, but not only, because of course research, science, and innovation are also a matter of the industry, of private companies, not only of the academic world. Of course, the number of women decrease as we go higher in the level of the infrastructure, of the structure of the research facilities. And these are the numbers, again, of the PhD students among the EU countries. As you see, again, the blue line are the men and the orange line are the women. And last but not least, I think it's important, especially now that artificial intelligence is one of the most debated topics of this era, to underline these data that comes from the United Nations. How many women are involved in artificial intelligence? Only 1 on 5 professionals, 22% of researchers in artificial intelligence are women. And this is really a problem for the future of our societies. And you can see the percentage in the different countries all over the world, with some peaks in unexpected countries like South Africa, but still largely under the threshold of the 50%. What's the problem when we bring these numbers to the daily life of a scientific institution like a university? I think that we can have some insight from looking at the publication, scientific publication. One of the important things that we know, and was stated in this article on Nature a few years ago, is that women feature only rarely as first or last authors in leading scientific journals. You can look at the numbers in this article. We won't go in depth into these features, but we know that this is a major problem. The first and the last authors are, let's say, the ones that represent, the ones that conducted the research, that led the research, or the chief of the lab or the research group. So this is really something that we can easily measure from the databases of scientific publications. An analysis of gender-based authorship trends in articles on a specific topic, which is pain medicine, over 10 years, also shows the same issue. Very few women that are authors of articles, although if you look at the people working in the hospitals, most of the doctors now, especially in specialties with a high level of care like pain management, are women. So there is a difference between what the scientists that are involved in publication and the one that actually work with the patients. They are, why? Probably because they are not involved in the research projects, or their position in the article is in the middle of the authorship and not as a first or last author. Is there a problem in peer review? Is harder for women to publish in peer-reviewed journals? This is an interesting systematic review that took into account all the existing researchers that use the double blind in peer review to see if it's actually possible to increase the presence of women by canceling in some way the implicit bias in the mind of the reviewers. And actually what this systematic review shows is that there are biases, small ones, at least according to the studies, but still significant, statistically significant biases in the selection. Of course, it's very, very hard to apply double blind in peer review, because it's quite easy for the reviewers, according to the bibliography that has to be added to the article when submitted, to identify the sex and the author of the article. So this is one of the problems, methodological problems, in analyzing this data, that probably underestimated the importance of the implicit bias in peer reviewing. There are also other biases, not only in peer reviewing. After the article has been published, is there a problem in citations? So do articles by women suffer from under-citation by their colleagues? We have few studies on this. This is one has been conducted in the field of astronomy, and actually demonstrates that there is an under-citation of women articles in the field of astronomical publications. Of course, again, it's hard to conduct this kind of studies, because citations depends on the quality of the article, and it's of course difficult to evaluate the quality of the article, but still with some methodological adjustment, it's possible to measure it, and more studies demonstrate that there is actually an implicit bias also in citation. And last but not least, what about the editorial board of the most important journals? This is an editorial that was published on The Lancet a few years ago that stated that gender equality on journal editorial boards, so the ones who decide what has to be published, is a major problem, at least in the field of medicine, because this was the topic of the article. What the author said is that it could be quite easy to fix this problem by involving more women editors in the journals, by selecting more editor-in-chief, people responsible, scientifically responsible of the contents of the peer-reviewed journals, in order to facilitate the career of women scientists. Other studies demonstrated that when you have a reviewer or an editor who is a woman, the opportunity, the possibility to publish for a woman increases, even if the quality of the article is the same. When they compared the results of peer review between women and men toward women's scientific publications, the results are in favor of women editors and women editorial boards. And this is exactly, this cartoon is taken from this editorial and shows the cycle of the bias. So what happens when we do not break this circle? So the problem is that we have less women in science, it's harder for them to publish, it's harder for them to go up into the researcher's career, it's harder for them to become members of editorial boards, and so if we don't break this, cycle, we will never solve the issue. If you don't publish, you don't get money. This is what demonstrates this cartoon by the NIH, where we have two different bars. The shorter ones are women, how many women have been granted with funds from the NIH, and how many men has been granted. It's just one of the many pictures that we can get from any funding agency that demonstrates that the bias in publication, actually because publications are one of the first selection criteria for grants, actually reflects into how much money women researchers can get. But there is a new issue. We are talking about gender gap in a binary way. We are talking about men and women, but ethics of research is now looking at the way human beings express their gender in a larger way. So a new important topic we have to face is inequality in science for the LGBTQ+ professionals. This is an article that was published in Science Advances about describing the issues that LGBTQ+ professionals are facing in STEM. The articles are coming out now. The researchers is starting, but what we see is that we are mirroring the situation and the numbers that we already demonstrated for women. This is another important articles that went out in a journal called Policy Insights from the Behavioral and Brain Sciences that describes not only the career issues that the LGBTQ+ members of the LGBTQ+ community faces, but also the same issues of implicit bias, sexual harassment, discrimination that women are facing. So now, if we want to tackle the problem of gender gap, we should think about gender in a non-binary way. One of the reasons why ethics of research is also interested in women researchers is because along the years, some studies demonstrated that women in science tend to have a better behavior. So women tend to be more ethical in their way of doing science. This is an interesting article that was published on Gender Action Portal by the Harvard School of Economics that demonstrates that women are more likely than men to have strongly internalized moral identities that leads to more ethical negotiation practices. So when they have to negotiate for any reason, for money, for hiring people, for solving issues, they tend to behave in a more ethical way. In this article, they describe a certain number of studies. The first group of studies demonstrate that women have more strongly internalized moral identities than men in selecting their collaborators. So in conducting interviews for job placement, and also that there are substantial situational factors that suppresses gender differences when women are in a leading position. And again, there are other studies that are described in this slide that demonstrate that women tend to behave in a more ethical way. What about ethics of research, the classical topic of ethics of research, which is fraud and misconduct? Are women better than men in science? This is a descriptive studies on retraction according to gender. How many articles are retracted from when the author is a woman, and how many when an author is a man? And actually what we see is that there is the results of this study show that articles by men tend to be retracted in a higher percentage. Not, I mean, the difference is not huge, but what is more interesting is the reason why the articles are retracted. Most of the articles retracted by that have a man authorship are retracted for fraud or plagiarism. Why? The reason why women's articles are retracted are more methodological. Often it's self-retraction, because the women are more prone to ask for a retraction when they realize that they committed a mistake. So even in the retraction world, the women tend to be more ethical. Is this good or not? This is a matter of discussion by social psychologists, because one of the reasons why women behave more ethically is for social desirability. They have been pushed to be better, to be nicer in the environment. So there are mixed approaches to this. Is this a good thing? Of course it's a good thing. But is this also a symptom of women trying to be more socially desirable, more prone to behave in the good way, to be the good girls? And this is exactly what this article describes from the perspective of social psychology. This is an interesting field of research. Are women intrinsically better, or are the women educated to be better? So is it possible, of course, not to disrupt the good behaviors of women, but to educate men to be better too? The last topic that is really important for ethics of research, because it's a matter of ethics of research, is the big third area of ethics of gender that, as we described at the beginning, we talked about sexism and implicit bias, and the third topic was sexual harassment. Can we consider sexual harassment as a scientific misconduct? There are some interesting stories that also reach the lay media, lay journals. These are two important stories, and I selected a man and a woman because I think it's important also to show that sexual harassment can also be a problem not only by men but also by women, even if of course the overwhelming majority of the cases of sexual harassment are actually done by men. These two important researchers, Pier Paolo Pandolfi and Avital Gonel, were both involved in important cases of sexual harassment. Pier Paolo Pandolfi was a researcher in cancer biology, in targeted therapy. He was an important researcher in Harvard. He was involved in a case of sexual harassment, a very heavy case of sexual harassment toward a PhD and then young researcher in his lab. He resigned from Harvard. Harvard did an internal evaluation, and after this evaluation, Pierpaolo Pandolfi voluntarily resigned. But he is now in charge of a research facility in Texas. Avital Ronell is a more interesting story. She is a very well-known researcher in gender studies. She is from Israeli citizenship, and she teaches at the New York University. She defines herself as a representative of the queer community, and one of her students, a gay young student, accused her of sexual harassment because she had very she used to have with her students very familiar behaviors, including things that are sincerely could be tricky for a professor, like inviting her students in her bedroom for poetry readings. What Avital Ronell said when her story went out was that these kind of behaviors are part of the queer culture. So that she said, this is my culture in my country, a Mediterranean country, used to be much warmer than in the United States, and also these kind of behaviors are expression of the queer culture, and we have to accept them. The Avital Ronell story is one of the few stories of sexual harassment involving women professors, and it went out during the Me Too movement. So according to a lot of gender studies scientists, it was something that went out in order to diminish the Me Too movement. But at the same time, it highlights a lot of interesting issues. Sexual harassment can also be a matter of culture. Sexual harassment can be a matter of local behaviors, and it is not always easy to frame sexual harassment in the academic environment. That's why we consider sexual harassment different from sexual assault or sexual abuse, which is a legal term that refers to unsolicited verbal or physical behaviors of sexual nature. And of course, this is often legally unacceptable, legally could bring to legal issues. How common is sexual harassment? There is a well-known study that was published by the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine in the United States that gives us the figures of this problem in science. The most common type of sexual harassment is gender harassment. It's a behavior that conveys the impression that women actually do not belong to the workplace. So they do not merit respect. So the most common issue is not necessarily the fact that they receive sexual attentions, but more the idea that they are there, but they shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be part of this lab. But it can bring to unwanted sexual attention. And of course, the last and more dangerous situation is sexual coercion. It's a pervasive problem. These are the figures. In general, these are the dates, the data coming from this survey in the United States. As you can see, in the percentage of women that states that they received some unsolicited sexual attention is between the 20% in non-STEM departments to even almost 50% in medicine. So what social scientists are wondering is what is there in the academic world, and especially in medicine, that brings this environment to have such a high level of sexual harassment. And there is only one field, one workplace that have a higher level of sexual harassment than the academic world, and is the military world. And the reason is because both academies and armies are very hierarchical systems. When you have a hierarchy, and you have power on the career of the younger or the people who work with you, sexual harassment is much more common. So one of the issues for the academic world is actually to understand how to overcome this hierarchy without disrupting, of course, the way we work in our universities and academies, but this strong hierarchical system is certainly not healthy for the behaviors. And this is a very well-known cartoon on every kind of sexual harassment. So there is the tip of the iceberg, which is the sexual coercion and what can bring someone to prison. But then there is a large number of behaviors that, including this kind of small remarks in chats, in your lab, in the way you speak with your colleagues, that can be part of the sexual harassment environment. What about Italy? We are in Italy. I teach ethics of research at the University of Pavia, so I just wanted to let you know that we are lacking of national data. There is only one questionnaire that was distributed among 23,000 students at the University of Perugia by an Italian researchers that demonstrated that among 3,300 responders, 72% of the responders were young women. And this bias in the respondents already shows the issue. Men are not interested. Men do not answer to the surveys. And among these 72%, 21% had experienced some form of gender-based violence. In most cases, it was verbal violence. In some cases, it was even physical violence. We have a protective law in Italy. The law 183, the Article 21 that was established in 2010, makes mandatory for the public administration to establish what is called the Comitato Unico di Garanzia, which is a protection committee. Each public administration has to organize one, and universities are part of the public administration, so they have one. It's mandatory to have one. However, a survey published in the late 2020 by a daily, Corriere della Sera, showed that only 32 out of 85 universities had appointed what is called the gender advisor, the sexual harassment advisor, which is an ombudsman that is mandatory according to this law. And almost no private university had one. Most of the private universities rely on external services to manage this kind of issue. This is what we did in University of Pavia. On our website, we have an email to reach an external advisor, a lawyer. She has no connection with the university and is available for anyone to deal with issues of mobbing, sexual harassment, and discrimination. This is a very effective and protective tool because it's of course impossible for someone who is in such a difficult situation to go and talk with the members of her or his department, of course, because there are always issues and fears about the career. So this kind of external advice is important and effective. At EU level, the Code of Research Integrity promoted by ALIA, the association that groups European academies, does not mention even once the term sexual harassment. It's a whole guideline on ethics of research in academy, and there's no mention of sexual harassment. It focuses only on the ethical way in which experimental protocols are created and the data are collected. So what the members of the academy are doing, and especially the European Platform of Women Scientists in 2018 promoted a declaration on sexual harassment, the PISA Declaration on Sexual Harassment in Higher Education and Research, asking to have more research on this and to develop more strategies to face this kind of issues. European Women Science called for data collection an unambiguous definition of sexual harassment, and what's most important, a common system of reporting and assessing and sanction, as well as a common way to support the victims. Is sexual harassment a problem of ethics of research? And this is the end of my lecture. According to the Association of Scientific Societies in the United States, 58% of women in academia in the US have dealt with unwanted sexual attention, and this has an impact on the training and on the career, because harassed students or doctoral students tend to avoid lessons, to avoid reaching the lab, and harassed researchers tend to avoid lab work and do not want to interact with their colleagues. So their career is highly impacted, but not only, science is impacted, because if these women, mostly of them are women, but sometimes also men, if these people are good scientists, we are losing their mind, we are losing their potential as researchers. And this is my final slide, with an article that was published on Nature on harassment that should be considered as a scientific misconduct. And I think that what's most important is a statement in this article. Ethics of research is not only about methodology, it's not only about data, it's not only about fraud and misconduct. Ethics of research is about people. It's about the way we behave as researchers and as scientists. And gender gap in science and sexual harassment in science are certainly one of the most important issues we have to face as scientists.